The Israeli military says it launched 25 airstrikes in Gaza over the past 24 hours. The attacks destroyed the top 3 floors of the Al-Sahaba Mosque in northern Gaza. The U.S. State Department said in a report yesterday that the conflict between Israel and Hamas continues to raise deeply troubling concerns for human rights, citing violations committed in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and citing reports of war crimes committed by Israel, Hamas, and Palestinian militant groups.
Hamas's horrific attacks on Israel on October 7th last year, and the devastating loss of civilian life in Gaza as Israel exercises its right to ensure that those attacks never happen again, have also raised deeply troubling human rights concerns. We continue to work every day to bring the fighting to an end, to secure the release of hostages held by Hamas and other groups, to uphold international humanitarian law, to prevent further suffering, to create a path toward a more peaceful and secure future for Israelis and Palestinians alike.
An independent review panel released a final 54-page report on UNRWA that revealed that Israel has yet to provide supporting evidence of the allegations that UNRWA employees were involved in October 7th. According to the new report by French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, the independent review group was appointed days after Israel's allegations against UNRWA, which employs 30,000 and serves nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees. Allegations of the involvement of UNRWA staff in the October 7th attack on Israel led donors to cut their funding to the agency, which has been a key channel of aid and support into Gaza. Joining us now to weigh in is Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Dr. Trita Parsi. Welcome back, Dr. Parsi.
Thank you for having me again.
I want to ask you about the response from the State Department about some of these allegations of human rights abuses. So far, there doesn't seem to have been any substantive response about the couple of mass graves that have been found on top of some of the attacks that have happened in the West Bank, where, of course, Hamas isn't in control. Can you elaborate on what's been going on and what kind of specific response or follow-up we've gotten from the Biden administration?
I think it's fair to say that the way the Biden administration has addressed and responded to this is by doing the absolute minimum to give the impression that it is looking at things, that is concerned about it, perhaps even doing something, but it is really not amounting to the type of reaction or anywhere close to the type of reaction we would have gotten had another country committed these type of crimes. At the end of the day, pointing out in generic terms that crimes, human rights violations, etc., are taking place without addressing the specific instances that are plentiful is a way for them to appear as if they're taking it seriously, but evading the responsibility of reacting in the manner that U.S. law actually mandates them to do when there are entities that are engaged in human rights violations who at the same time are getting funding and arming and ammunition from the United States. Until we get to that point, this is essentially time wasting by the administration, and it's something that essentially is designed to give the Israelis more time to do what they're doing rather than actually putting the type of a pressure that could put a stop to all of this.
And what is it that Israelis are doing? What do you think their goals are at this point?
Well, to the extent that you can argue that there are some clear-cut goals that the Israelis have, and that it's not just actions that they're taking in manner that are quite unstrategic and not thought through. It does appear to me as if the Israeli government right now is trying to depopulate Gaza, annex certain parts of it, if not all of it, and play the long game in order to achieve that. And that means that they are constantly pushing the envelope. They're not doing it in one move. They're doing it in the boil the frog type of a way, and hoping that the world will come to accept this just as much as the United States, for instance, has come to accept this network of settlements that the Israelis have been building over the course of the last 4 decades that are making any viable two-state solution next to impossible. The United States originally viewed them as illegal under international law, then an obstacle to a two-state solution, then not necessarily a part of the problem. Under the Trump administration, they were more or less accepted. Now we've gone back to a formulation that doesn't view them as positive. But in terms of actually doing anything about it, the United States has, in essence, accepted them because it has dropped the demand on the Israelis to accept the Palestinian state in order for there to be peace. Instead, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have invested in the Abraham Accords, which essentially means that we're asking Arab states to drop the final piece of leverage they had in order to actually get a two-state solution, getting a Palestinian state, which is to say that they would require Israel to recognize and to see the establishment of a Palestinian state before they normalize relations with Israel. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration has pushed for Arab states to drop that demand, recognize Israel, normalize with Israel, and essentially argued that direct flights between Ben Gurion Airport and Riyadh or Dubai is the equivalent of peace rather than the actual establishment of a Palestinian state. Which means that the Israeli strategy of forcing this onto the United States and eventually getting the United States to accept all of these settlements, all of these illegal outposts has been successful.
Yeah, I read your op-ed in the New York Times earlier this week going into some of that. Frankly, it looks like this effort is succeeding on some level, or at least getting basically Saudi Arabia to be okay with, or the Saudi Arabian government to signal openness to this being the reality for Palestine. I mean, just tell us frankly, is that working? It seems to be sort of working in terms of the long game.
It is sort of working in the sense that MBS is desperate to be able to get this deal because he wants the security guarantees that the United States is offering. So this is the other aspect of it that is really important for the American public. The Biden administration is pushing a deal that would have the United States sign off to defend and kill and die, have American soldiers kill and die for the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia. And in return, the Saudis would recognize Israel. On top of that, incidentally, the United States is also contemplating giving the Saudis the nuclear fuel cycle, something that the United States fought very hard for over 2 decades to prevent the Iranians from having, and which violates the broader approach that the United States has had to the proliferation of nuclear technology. But all of that is going to be granted to the Saudis in return for not a concession to the U.S., but a concession to Israel with a recognition. That may work in the sense that the Saudi government may agree to it. Will it work in terms of actually establishing peace? On the contrary, I am quite convinced that it is these type of measures that have essentially said to the Palestinians, your investments for 2.5 decades in a diplomatic route to achieve your national right for statehood has been not only a failure, it was never intended to succeed from our end. And what does that do? That dramatically increases the likelihood that the Palestinians will return to violence, which is exactly what we have seen. If the Biden administration doubles down on this, the only likely outcome is more violence in the region, not peace.
I think that's a really important point, and I appreciate your analysis, but a part of me is thinking when you're talking that the most significant evidence that we need to point to corroborate America's disinterest and actually following through on its so-called commitment to a two-state solution is the fact that it just vetoed recognition of Palestine as a state as a UN member nation at the end of last week. Are you surprised by how little that seems to be playing into the news cycle? Not to mention the fact that I just checked and reconfirmed, the New York Times has literally declined to cover, days into this scandal, the 2 mass graves that have been found with bodies of Palestinians with catheters, with hospital scrubs, clearly patients and doctors from hospitals. What is going on here with the impunity that the American political system and media system seem to be acting with, allowing these kinds of atrocities to happen without any abridgment in funding, allowing mere accusations from Israel, as we talked about at the top of the segment, to result in hundreds of millions of dollars of funding cut to the main Palestinian aid organization, at the same time that clear evidence of mass atrocities offer no abridgment, cause no abridgment to the funding from the United States to Israel.
You're quite right, and let me make 2 points. The first point is on the fact that, yes, this was a clear piece of evidence that the United States is not serious, has not been serious about the statehood, because when the opportunity existed to just do a symbolic acceptance of a Palestinian state, giving them a membership at the UN, which does not define their borders or in any way, shape, or form. It does not predetermine the final outcome of a two-state negotiation. All it does do is to say that the outcome has to include a Palestinian state at the end. That was unacceptable to the Biden administration. The other part of that story that has also been underreported is that the United States essentially failed to get any of its close allies, at least in sufficient numbers, to vote with it in a manner that would have enabled the Biden administration to not have to use the veto. They tried to get Japan, South Korea, Ecuador to vote against it. And if enough non-permanent member states had voted against it, there would be no need for the United States to use its veto. It utterly failed. And what that tells us is how isolated the United States has become at the UN on these issues as a result of the Biden administration's policy. When the Russians did the same thing to themselves and became rightfully isolated because of their invasion of Ukraine, that was all over the news. Here, we're not talking at all about how we have ended up in a very similar situation, if not worse, as a result of these vetoes. The second point I'll make in your question, and I agree with the premise of it, is that if we take a look at what's happening in the United States, with the media not covering many of these things, the clampdown on protests at universities, the infringement on the right to assembly, the right to free speech, and you take a look at what's happening in Europe, particularly in Germany, in which they've gone even further, closing down conferences, forbidding a former EU minister to speak on these issues. What you're seeing is that for a country to be able to sustain this degree of support for Israel's policies and slaughter in Gaza, it requires that you sacrifice a big part, a key part of your own democracy at home. And that, I think, is a very scary reality. People should recognize that that is the price the United States is going to pay. It's not just the isolation internationally. It's also what it does to ourselves at home.
Trita Parsi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.